Yeah, it's great to see everybody here. This is, throughout my tenure of living here, growing up around here, walking up and down the railway tracks from Sebringville to Stratford to Mitchell and all that stuff, I've always had a certain affinity for rail. And, someone my age, approaching 70, your parents talked about the shops with such reverence and such importance. And I think, I just did a bit of an interview with CKCO and they said, why is this so important? And I said, well, we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, about why the shops are so important to Stratford historically, but also why they're so important socially. And why I always say that Stratford's a lot different than a lot of places this size throughout Ontario. When I was at the Beacon Herald, I was a regional publisher, and I would go for meetings in, not to, cast shade on anybody, but, to St. Thomas or to Chatham or to Peterborough or places like that, or Woodstock. And I always say I'd go to places sort of the same size as Stratford, and if there was a place to eat at lunch, you were always really lucky. And I said, in Stratford, you come here, you had 13 places to eat at lunch. And I said that was just one of the canaries in the coal mine, how I often thought Stratford was a little bit of a different place. So tonight, as everybody knows, there's an 18-acre site just on the cusp of downtown. There's a building there that's just under 1 million square feet. It's been empty for most of my life, for most of our lives, and we are now at a critical stage of this project. My job and a guy named Andrew Hilton both volunteered to be part of the committee, the ad hoc committee, and we're the communications people. And part of my job is to tell the story of the site in general, and also to give people a bit of an update, but also a bit of a two-way conversation. And as we've had a lot of sessions like this, and people have said, well, what do you think about this? Or, why don't you do something like that? And every time, even Monday night, there was 2 or 3 good ideas that came forward Monday night. So it's really not so much a presentation as it is a bit of a conversation, because somebody's always got something for us that we take back to the ad hoc committee and then we relay to City Council. So in summary, to get started, this is really where we're at, where the site is at, what's possible, what's improbable, what's unlikely, and what really could happen here. So Kelly, if we get started, I've got my assistant Kelly back there because I can't work the flicker to change the screen. So this is a picture here that we took this summer. So this is, we had a bit of a tour for the ad hoc committee with some engineers, and you can see here that the roof deck is gone. And one of the reasons for that, and this is really its current state, the roof deck's gone. They took off these massive, incredibly over-engineered planks that were about 8 inches thick, 1 foot wide, and 18 feet long. And that's what the roof deck was made up of. And what they did is they took the tar paper off the top of it, took the steel off, and they've repurposed, taken all these huge, planks and set them all aside, cleaned the asbestos off them, had the asbestos taken away, and they're all set aside, wrapped in tarps and plastic, because the idea is that they're going to get reused someday. In the interim, they went and they powder coated all of the ceiling, and we'll talk about the structure of the building itself, but this is really a good start to look at here. Here's another picture taken from inside. And this is the mezzanine. So this is the second deck. You go up a flight of stairs, and this is sort of the second floor of the shops. Now, Steve Cooper here, Steve's a friend of mine. He's also on the committee, and he's done a fabulous virtual walkthrough of the building. And we were really going to try and show that tonight, but it really warrants sort of its own attention. And, Steve went in there with robotic cameras, and you can almost walk through the entire site, through the entire building from the inside. So that resides currently on the city's website, Engage Stratford. You go down to the Grand Trunk Renewal project, and you can find a link there for that. But also, by the end of the week, Kelly is obliged, and the link is also going to be on the museum website on the home page. That'll be a little easier to navigate through. So if you want to get a real good look at the inside of the building, you're going to be able to do that there as well. So here's 2 pictures just to give you some idea of the scope of the building. So the picture at the top is a black and white photo. This is a Perth County Archives photo, and it was featured in Dean Robinson's wonderful book about the site. And then I was here, the other picture I took this summer to try and replicate and give a bit of an idea is how similar the building is to when it closed and also a little bit at how different it is. It's not a lot different. You know, you look at those two pictures, you know, other than the roof, you know, the building is in lots of ways not a lot different than it was the day that Cooper Bessemer moved out, you know, in the 1960s. So this is, gives one of the historical photos, again, from the archives. And the reason I wanted to include this is, for my lifetime, I've always seen the place with sort of steel cladding on it. You know, and it's got that sort of, you know, gray aluminum steel cladding on it. And I just wanted to include this picture to give some sort of idea of, you know, the architectural merit of the building. And, you know, you look at all these windows, hundreds and hundreds of windows. And I said, I know they had firemen and they had mechanics and they had first aid people and they had their own hospital and they had, you know, people that worked on the steam engines and all that stuff. And I said, and they must have had about 10 people that cleaned windows. When I look at this, I just think, gee, that's a job in itself. But as we talk about what's next, you know, one of the things we hope to see is that, you know, some of that steel cladding goes off the side. We expose some of the windows. Some of the windows maybe get replaced by whoever develops it or the city does it. The grass gets cut. Some of those great big cement blocks that protect the building from I don't know what, from going in there. The fence comes down. And ideally, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think hopefully that's the next stage. So just a bit of a timeline here. This is a bit of a history of how we got to where we are today. And it's, you know, I didn't really appreciate this until I really got on this, until I got on this committee. We have a railway exhibit here at the museum, and a lot of the information here came out of that exhibit. And during the process of researching for our railway exhibit here, there was a lot of aha moments for me. There was, geez, you know, I've lived here since, you know, 1957. And, you know, been by that shop many times and thought I knew everything about it. And as is often the case, that wasn't the case. So I just thought it was important to include a little bit of a timeline. So 1870, 3 years after Confederation, the shops begin. Not huge, not huge. 30,000 square feet. To put that in context, the Stratford Perth Museum is 100,000 square feet. So a third the size of this building was the original shops. Nonetheless, hundreds of families moved to Stratford, and the population, for all intents and purposes, doubles. You go from 4,300 to over 8,000 people in the course of a few weeks. So we talk about not having enough housing now, which is very much a case now. There's tent cities formed here. There was people sleeping outside, and in addition to that, some of the hotels that people our age or my age remember, you know, the Dominion House, the Kent Hotel, the Empire Hotel, the Avon Hotel, they all really sprung up right around that time, and they weren't really hotels at all. They were really sort of boarding houses, and they housed workers. And that's why, as you look right around there, you know, even the Mansion House, which is where the parlor is now, right around there on the perimeter of that property, 5, 6 hotels. They were really boarding houses for workers. 1886, the city gives $60,000 to Grand Trunk Railway to expand the shops. And in 1888, Stratford wins a bid against Montreal and Winnipeg, and the shops expand again, this time to 125,000 square feet. 1909, this is a huge expansion. This time the site doubles to 250,000 square feet, and the Grand Trunk Railway buys 4 city blocks and starts building houses, all rented or sold to workers. So the 4 streets that go off St. David Street, I live on one of them. You've got Mackenzie Street, Stratford Street, Argyle Street, and Nelson Street. Grand Trunk Railway bought those 4 blocks and built homes. And we think about the innovative nature of the Grand Trunk Railway compared to what we see for industry and corporations now. And as they built those 4 blocks and built all those houses, they had a rent-to-own program. So for people who brought their families and wanted to live in Stratford, a portion of your rent could be applied to the purchase of the house. And one of the reasons was they didn't want a transient workforce. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, you know, as we move through here, how they really wanted to create a community and they wanted people to work in the shops for life. And that was really the idea. So don't rent your place. Don't live in a boarding house. Don't rent a room there. Rent one of these houses, and in a number of years, be a few years, but less than it takes to buy a house now, you'd end up with a house in Stratford. So interestingly enough, as we talk about the culture of Stratford, the social fabric of this community, now those streets, as I say, I live on Argyle Street, every 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, somebody buys one of those smaller houses on that street, adds a renovation to it, fixes it up, cuts some of the trees, that's a different driveway, and all of a sudden that area now, 100 years later, is sort of being, I think the term is gentrified, and now you're starting to have sort of a second or third generation for that neighborhood, that it's becoming, a bit of a different neighborhood again. And we can trace, like a lot of the things that happened, we can trace it back to decisions that were made really around the turn of the last century. Melville Hayes was the head of the Grand Trunk Railway. He was from Montreal, Canadian, spent a lot of time in Britain. And Melville, Saskatchewan, by the way, is named after Melville Hayes. He was part of the railway that went across the country, spent a lot of time in Saskatchewan, and Melville, Saskatchewan is named after Melville Hayes. Interesting little anecdote here, saved the company from bankruptcy, then he got hired to run the Grand Trunk Railway, and he committed to Stratford for the expansion. Interestingly enough, Stratford ends up with this huge railway repair yard in Stratford. Stratford was up against Winnipeg, Toronto, and Montreal, and it ends up in Stratford. Many of us who live here know that Stratford historically has punched over its weight, overachieves. I'm proud to say that I see that with whether it's the Stratford Festival or downtown, our hockey teams, whatever. I always feel we punch a bit above our weight. So how did Stratford end up with this huge employer with a huge investment from Grand Trunk Railway? Well, they had a banquet in Stratford. And Melville Hayes came to visit, and they had what was called the Board of Trade at the time, which is a precursor to the Chamber of Commerce. City councillors were there, leaders of industry were there. They had a nice banquet, and Melville Hayes sat next to the daughter of one of Stratford's leading industrialists. Melville Hayes ended up having a tryst with that daughter. And he made several trips to Stratford as a result of that, because he's married, by the way, and he had made several trips to Stratford because he had a wonderful relationship with a woman from Stratford. We can all speculate as to how the Grand Trunk Railway ended up in Stratford. I think that's the best theory. It's certainly the most interesting one. So that's what we'll go with. Ironically, Melville Hayes died in the Titanic in 1912, coming from England to Stratford. He was headed to Stratford and he died in the Titanic. We talk about the shops for railway, of course. What a huge employer it was, economic driver. Huge impact on the war effort. 1917, the shops stopped repairing steam engines, convert totally to munitions. 1/3 of the shells fired by the British and the Allies in World War I came from Canada. And the shops in Stratford produced 440,000 18-pound shells. We've got a couple in our collection here at the museum. 440,000 of them came out of that factory in Stratford. Huge impact on the war effort. 1923, GTR and Grand Trunk, the CNR and Grand Trunk Railway merge, become the biggest railway in Canada. 1939 again, war breaks out again, and the shops switch operations again. This time, they refurbish steam engines from Europe. Hard to imagine that it was economically viable that steam engines that were damaged during the war, damaged in bombing, or were out of service because they were dated, were shipped to Stratford, by ship, then put on rail in Halifax, brought to Stratford, repaired, and sent back to Europe. In fact, in the post-war years, I was watching a documentary about 6 months ago about post-war Europe. They had steam engines into the 1970s, and some of those had been refurbished in Stratford as a result of the war. All the places in Europe that historically had repaired trains, they were all about making tanks. They're about making tanks, and they're about making airplanes, and all industry that's related to the war. And Stratford played a role in keeping Europe not only rolling as much as it could during the war, but post-war as well. That's one of the things I didn't know much about until we really got into this project here. Employment goes from 363 at the start of the war to 1,157, including 67 women. Now, we think 67 women working in the shops. First blush, that's not a surprising number. Crailers employed all sorts of women. White meat packing employed all sorts of women. But for 67 women to work in heavy industry, in a really industrial environment, at that point in time, not only was interesting and integral, but I can draw a straight line to the economy of Stratford as a result of women working in places like Crailers, Krug Furniture, White Meat Packing, and the shops. Kelly McIntosh, you saw at the start, did a great play a couple of years ago called Women of the CNR, and it talked about the experience of women working in a real industrial environment. Now, I can't help but note that Roxy Baker's here. Roxy's a great friend of mine, a great friend of the museum, and I have often drawn a straight line from the 67 women that were working at the shops, Krug Furniture, Crailers, and Imperial Furniture, White Meat Packing, to the role of women in the workforce in Stratford, which I think was a lot different than lots of other places. So these 67 women who, when the war's over, are going to be displaced. Men are coming home from the war, and they're going to be displaced, and they're going to lose their jobs. And a lot of them said, I don't want to lose my job. I want to stay here. I want to continue to work here. So for people my age, you take not long after the war, if people are home by 1948, 1959, etc. By the time you get into the late 1960s, huge factories built out at the end of Erie Street by a company called American Motors. American Motors then it got bought by Chrysler, and then it became Canadian Fabricated Products, and that became the largest CAW local in Canada. That was the majority of that local was women. Roxy was integral to that, and that was a real, I'm not a trade unionist, but I'm not oblivious to the role that labor has played in the economy and in the way of life and in wages and working conditions and all those things. So you can draw a line from the 67 women working there to the largest CAW local in Canada that was dominated by women. And that's what Canada Fab was. So now all of a sudden, as you come into the booming economy in the 1960s and 1970s, you've got lots of homes in Stratford where there's two good wages. The husband's got a good job, head of the household, he's got a good job. But the wife's got a great job. 1,000 people working at Canada Fabricated Products. So now all of a sudden, you've got people buying furniture, you got people buying homes, you got people taking vacations. And I think that a little thing like that has an impact that still exists today. And that's why Stratford, I think, has had a little bit of a different economy, or a lot different economy, through the 1960s and 1970s, and even as we are here today. 1950, the shops reaches its peak in employment with 1,500 workers. How big a deal was the shops? How big a deal was it from an economic standpoint? 40% of the homes in Stratford, when the shops announced they were closing, either somebody in the house worked at the shops, or they used to work at the shops, or they worked for a company whose their main customer was the shops. 40% of the homes. So we think about company towns like Kirkland Lake or Oshawa or Windsor or places like that. Stratford was not a lot different. So it's hard for us now to say the shops are closing. Oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever going to happen. This community is going to die. It was a problem. It's no different than the gold mines leaving Kirkland Lake or Timmins or places like that, or Elliott Lake. And Stratford was at a real turning point in its history. And ironically, I would say its decision about what it does next about this building is an equally significant turning point as to what the next 50 years looks like. So when we talk about the closing of the shops, the emotional part of it, as I did research about this, the last day for the majority of the shops was called Boot Day. And that's the euphemism for that was the day they got the boot. They had a huge banquet, huge party. There might have been some beer. And there's a lot of 3-generation families there, and some 4-generation families where their kids had worked there. And people like I gave this presentation out at the Army Navy, and Larry Shurey talked about how he worked there, his dad worked there, his grandfather worked there, and it's hard for us to think in real scale as to what a significant event that was when the shops closed. Kelly?
Yeah, you're great, John. If you just stay a bit in your life.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I wonder. Sorry here. So socially, we think about the social impact of the shops. So not only do you have the economic part, but here's the social impact. So top left is National Stadium. There was a very robust employees club called the CNRA, the Canadian National Railway Association. It was the employees club for all intents and purposes. The company gave the employees, good funding to do certain things to build amenities in this community. And one of the reasons for that was they wanted people to stay here for life. They wanted to be able to attract employees. We look at now how all companies are doing all sorts of things like being able to work remotely and things like that so that you can draw employees. Same thing. The Grand Trunk Railway was really interested in drawing people from all over so they'd come here. So they built National Stadium. That was built solely by the Employees Club with money from the employees and also from the company. Part of the reasons for that was the ball team there was used to attract employees. And not dissimilar to what the Stratford Cullitons did or the Stratford Warriors did before that. Or the Stratford Indians before that. There would be a good hockey player someplace. How'd you like to move to Stratford and play hockey here or baseball here? And by the way, we have a job for you. A pretty good job. And that was a real recruiting thing. So National Stadium played a role in that. Bottom left, that's the original YMCA. It is located on the exact same spot as the current YMCA. Why it was located there? They used steam from the shops to heat the pool. So now, ironically, 100 and some years later, one of the potential anchor tenants is the YMCA. And they'd like to move from that spot into the building, and the city takes that spot, and it's sort of very serendipitous. Here we are 100 and some years later, and the Y is still part of the conversation about what the original future of that property looked like and what the future of that property may look like. Bottom right, similarly, the Employees Club developed the Stratford Municipal Golf Course. It was the city had given those two sites where the National Stadium is and where the golf course is, and the employees essentially laid out the golf course, put paths, build a little clubhouse, and eventually it gets turned over to the municipality, and it's a nice little 9-hole golf course. It can draw its history back to the origins of the shops. And top right, this is just around the corner from me. So these 5 houses were built as part of that building boom that we talked about in the early 1900s. Depending on which history book you look at, the 5 Angels, the 5 Sisters. This is a picture that I took late last year. You can tell by the recycling boxes to give a bit of dating. But those 5 houses are identical. And they were built by the company. They were all rented out to workers, and they still exist there today. Again, a permanent reminder of the shops and its influence here in Stratford. Social influence. Some may know, Kelly mentioned I had a little bit to do with hockey. I had nothing to do with the selection of the World Junior team. I was not a coach. I was not on the bench, but I was down there. But I do have a bit of affinity for hockey history. So the guy in the bottom in the sports jacket is a guy named Craig Campbell. So Craig Campbell is the curator at the Hockey Hall of Fame. Longtime friend of mine, dates back to when I was a sports writer at the Beacon Herald. And Craig came here to the museum with his 2 daughters and a friend to see the Justin Bieber exhibit. So I end up talking to Craig, and he says, "Hey, can we go in the collection room? Can we look at some of your hockey stuff?" I said, "Sure." We go in there and we look at some travel cases that the Stratford Indians had. We had Howie Meeker's skates that he left at Howie Meeker played junior in Stratford. He rushed out of the house. The house was down on Avon Street. The woman's name was Lil Parker. That was the boarding house. He rushed out of the house, left his skates because he was headed for World War II. When he came back from World War II, he said, "I'll come back to Stratford and get my skates." He ended up going straight from Halifax at the end of World War II to the Toronto Maple Leafs, where he became Rookie of the Year in the National Hockey League after serving in World War II for 4 years. John Parker, Lil's son, brought his skates in and said, "These are Howie Meeker's skates." and he never came to pick them up. We've left him a note a couple times, but he's never come to get them. I tell Craig that story, and then I said, and by the way, we've got a hockey stick here from a guy named Charlie Lightfoot. He says, no. I said, yeah, we do. Charlie Lightfoot. So Charlie Lightfoot is the person up in the top right corner. Up in the team picture on the left, that's the 1905 Stratford team. So Stratford, that team, the Ontario Hockey Association formed in 1896. Stratford had a team in 1900, one of the first 7 teams in the OHA. Charlie Lightfoot was on that team, and that team won the Ontario Junior Championship and Senior Championship. They played in 2 leagues and won them both. Charlie Lightfoot was one of the best players on the team. So Charlie Lightfoot, if we think about our age, and there are people I know, like my parents, knew Charlie Lightfoot, and we think about how old Charlie Lightfoot was. Charlie Lightfoot's father was an escaped slave from Kentucky, fled up here under the Underground Railroad and settled in Chatham, Ontario, where the Underground Railway finished, where a lot of blacks, escaped slaves, ended up in Chatham. Chatham, the railway repair factory there, and there was lots of them that repaired trains, they had hockey tournaments. Charlie played hockey for Chatham. Stratford played against Chatham. Charlie Lightfoot was a really good player. Stratford invited Charlie to come and play in Stratford and gave him a job at the shops. He ended up playing on this OHA team, and as Craig Campbell said, quite likely the first black player in organized hockey in the world, playing for Stratford. So you think about that, in 1902, he's playing for Stratford in the Ontario Hockey Association, 50 years before Willie O'Ree plays in the National Hockey League and is the first black player in the NHL. 50 years earlier, there's another social impact. We had that stick signed, and there's the ceremony there. We gave that stick to the Hockey Hall of Fame. They had an exhibit called Players of Color. They said, we'd really like to have that stick signed by Charlie Lightfoot. Ran it through the board here, said, that's where that stick probably belongs. And we gave it to the Hockey Hall of Fame. It's on display there. Kelly? So the long-standing economic, cultural influence, we've talked a lot about that. Up in the top right corner is, the women of the CNR. We've talked about that. The bottom left corner is the apprenticeship program they had. This is 1 year's graduating class for the Grand Trunk Railway apprenticeship program. So apprenticeship program is very familiar to us now with skilled trades. We know all about them. The people who work at the Stratford Festival. They know all about the apprenticeship program there. I worked at the Beacon Herald, the very robust, very important apprenticeship program there. And the reason for that was, before trade unions, before labor laws, before health and safety laws, apprenticeship programs were important because you could get killed. You could get killed working at the shops, you could get killed working at the Beacon Herald, you could get killed working in lots of factories, and that's why you had an apprenticeship program. It was a safety-driven idea. First year you do this, second year you do that, third year you help somebody, fourth year you job shadow, fifth year you might be able to work by yourself and somebody works with you and you start the process over again. The economic influence of an apprenticeship program is job security, good wages, good working environment, robust economy, spending money, and the apprenticeship program at the shops is now sort of the standard for what we see in the apprenticeship program for skilled trades. But it was a precursor in heavy industry, and so here's 75, 100 people in one calendar year who've now got much better jobs. And they've got highly trained jobs, safe jobs, well-paying jobs, and all of a sudden the City of Stratford's got another great a group of employees who are making good money, who've decided to live here, who decide to build a house and have a real impact on the community. And by the way, far less likely to move away. So now we get into post-war. 1952, the writing's on the wall as railways around the world switched from steam to diesel. Stratford, in its defense, made a very robust and heated full-court press to the CNR to try and make Stratford to be a diesel repair place. Two problems with that. One, diesel locomotives don't require nearly as much maintenance as steam locomotives. They don't have to get certified 3 times a year. They're very unlikely to explode and kill people. So, the move to diesel meant far less maintenance. Secondly, no girlfriends in Stratford for the head of the CNR. So the CNR repair yards ended up in Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg, which in lots of ways makes more sense. We think about 1952 and the idea that the shops are going to close. I can't imagine the angst at City Council, at the Chamber of Commerce, in the housing market, where there's real estate agents, people running, Kresge's department store, thinking, geez, what's going to happen to this community? If we think about the serendipitous things, I often think about, Tom Patterson and his vision of the idea that a 6-week summer festival showing Shakespeare is going to save the city's economy when you've got 1,400 people getting thrown out of work. I often think about that conversation where Tom Patterson says, I know what we'll do. We'll have a 6-week summer festival in a tent outdoors in Stratford, and that's going to save everything. I often thought that, Bob Newhart used to do this sort of phone call routine where he'd be on the phone with Walter Raleigh, and he said, so you grow this stuff, and people smoke it, and it makes them sick. And you think this is going to be... I often think that Tom Patterson talking to City Council couldn't have been a lot different. But what do I know? Here we are, 70 years later, and the Stratford Festival seems to be okay. They've got about 1,000 employees. It's had a pretty good impact on the economy. Rolls about $1 billion a year into the area. So, Tom, kudos to you. What did I know? 1955, a series of layoffs take place, and in 1959, the transition to closure is all but complete. The CNR gradually leases more and more of the building to a company called Cooper Bessemer. They hang around for a while. In 1984, Cooper Bessemer moves its work elsewhere and ceases operations at the site. So 1984, from that point on, the building's essentially been empty since 1984. So 40 plus years, coming up on half a century, that building's been empty. Roughly 1 million square feet, 18-acre property, right on the cusp of downtown, 40 years. So when someone says to these things, I'm sort of losing patience, and is this going to get done in my lifetime? And my question is, well, how healthy are you? And how long do you think you're going to live? So, because it's been 40 years so far, but hope springs eternal. 1985, it's too bad Karen Haslam wasn't here tonight. She was here Monday. Her and Dave Hunt lived through this. 1985, a Toronto company called Landon purchased a property from CN, and they were going to build a huge shopping mall. They'd done Yorkdale. They were involved in places like Masonville Mall. They did Fairview Mall. They're a huge, well-respected company. The economy turns terrible right at that point, right in 1985. From 85 to the end of that decade, economy goes completely south. Interest rates are 22, 23%, and that company goes by the by. They abandon the property. Kelly? So 1991, City purchases the building from Landon. 1996, bit of clarification here. For all of us that have lived through this, particularly me at the Beacon Herald, and the legend of Lawrence Ryan. And Dave Hunt, who was mayor at the time, took a lot of heat, and it was about 3 letters to the editor every week about why would the city ever sell the property to Lawrence Ryan. So matter of clarification, the city didn't sell the property to Lawrence Ryan. The city sold the property to a guy named Ray Jacobs. Ray Jacobs was a construction guy from Breslau, largely a trucking company, and he had purchased the property, and he was connected through his construction company to hotel companies. And he had hoped to develop a Wyndham Hotel on the property, and that was the idea. What happens again, he and his partner, Lawrence Ryan, they end up getting sued by the TTC. Their stock and trade was they built subway stations. And that's what Ray Jacobs' main job was, subway stations, and Lawrence Ryan was a partner of his. He gets sued. His name's on the quotes. His name's on the contracts. He goes into financial duress. One of his largest creditors is Lawrence Ryan. That's how Lawrence Ryan ends up with the property, as a settlement with Ray Jacobs, who had been his partner. Lawrence Ryan, great guy. He used to come to the museum, or he used to come to the Beacon Herald 4:30 on Friday afternoons, often with a box about the size of a beer case full of documents that he wanted me to read over the weekend because there was some great revelation in here that I needed to know about. And he said, you know, I'm going to leave this with you over the weekend. I want you to read all this stuff, and then I want you to write a big editorial next week about how smart I am and how awful everybody else is. So one change that had in my life was I started to leave work at 4 o'clock on Fridays, as a matter of course, and I'd come in Monday. Lawrence would be saying, you know, where are all these documents? I said, they're on the front counter right where you left them. And no, I didn't have a chance to read them. I remember Lawrence came in and he had a drawings, architecture drawings, 3 25-story office towers. So here we are in 2024, and there's great angst in and around Giro Street because I think is it 7, 8, or 9 stories they're thinking about there? I can't remember. 10 maybe. So 10 stories there. Lawrence wanted 3 25-story office towers there, condos, office space. I'm not sure. Anecdotally, it took sort of a year to fill the Bradshaw lofts to sell those off, and that you're going to build 3 25-story office towers. And I often said, Lawrence, what do you got planned for the place? And he said, do you have a thesaurus? I said, yes. He said, look up entertainment. And everything under entertainment was going to be what was there. He talked about a movie theater, an arena, a water park, Olympic aquatic complex, a bowling alley. I know there one time he talked about horseshoe pits. Pickleball wasn't invented yet, so that wasn't included, but if it would be today. 2003, a major fire engulfs the main building and basically renders it to an empty shell. So what burns in that place? That's the question. You know, what would burn in that building? You've got 3-foot concrete walls, you've got a steel ceiling, you've got the floors are 4 feet thick, they're concrete. So what exactly burns? The roof. The roof burns. The roof was these great big wooden planks. That's really what burned. That's why the fire looks so spectacular. 2008, City Council begins the expropriation process, and the University of Waterloo at the same time indicates it wants to put a university on that site. By the way, a lengthy legal process came afterwards. Lengthy. It finished in June of 2023. It was the longest expropriation process in the history of the province of Ontario. It eclipsed another one that we know about, which was the Walmart property in Woodstock, which was Blandford Mall, then Walmart, and now the Toyota site. So Stratford, again, punching above its weight, had the longest expropriation process in the history of the province. Kelly? So here's the fire that took place in 2003. I think a lot of us remember that. And we talk about the building being indestructible. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. This year, and I see Rob Ritz here. Rob Ritz was part of a group, about 7, 8, 9 years ago. Lauren Bolton, Alan Waddingham, people like that really petitioned the city to say, this building has huge historical significance. Some of it or all of it should be saved. So, for those that think that way, we're fortunate. I'm one of those people that think it should be saved. I went through the property last summer. Independent engineers, as well as city engineers, said the building in its current state is about 109% of 2024 building standards. Given the thickness of the wall, the robustness of the building, the floor, etc., it is hugely robust. In addition to that, as we talk about pictures like this, Jim Archibald, who's an engineer for the city, we had a conversation with a guy named Andy Verbanik, who worked for Infrastructure Ontario, who was part of this committee. And I said, out of curiosity, if you wanted to knock down this building, could you knock it down? And how big a job is that? He said, we've sort of roughly done the math, roughly. He said, you would have to build a factory on site. That's the first thing. You'd build a factory on site, you would knock the building down best you can, you would take all the concrete, it would go through these grinders, you'd try and turn it into gravel or something like that, but because of the usage of the property, which was, heavy industrial, not all of that gravel could go for traditional uses. And some of it, maybe a lot of it, would have to go to a landfill site that's the other side of St. Thomas. He said, we've done the math, we're talking about maybe 15,000, 16,000, 17,000 dump truck loads of gravel that would have to go from Stratford just over about an hour and 10 minutes away to the other side of St. Thomas. There was a time in our history that people would go, oh well, but the idea of carbon footprint and taking all that gravel somewhere and and empty trucks coming back and doing that for 2, 3, 4 years, if you can use the building, you should use the building. And there's no reason they can't. So one of the things is we know that's probable, likely, for sure, improbable. The city's not tearing the building down. They've made an absolute commitment to that. So I think that's a win for a lot of people with a heritage standpoint, and also on an environmental standpoint. I think that's a win. One of the funny things about that picture is, for those who remember me when I was at the Beacon Herald, I wrote one of my main jobs was editorials. And from time to time, I may have been hard on the Stratford Fire Department. That was a favorite subject of mine that, is that money well spent, et cetera, et cetera. So I remember in the editorial this year, I was in somebody's house and they had the editorial cut out. It was on the fridge about 20 years later. And it said that I had written an editorial about this fire. I said, it was the first fire that the Stratford Fire Department ever put out, and it's the one they should have let go. So, those divisions with the Stratford Fire Department are long gone. We had an exhibit here, and they do a great job. Kelly? So 2015, the City Council decides that lease of the portion of the building should be saved and the history of the site recognized. That's gone past that now. They're going to save the vast majority of the building. We'll talk about what part's going to see the biggest change. In addition to that, the museum here, from the outset, reached out to the city and said, for an historic element of it, the museum would like to be involved. It would like to have some sort of significance here. The timeline that is in the railway exhibit here and the timeline that is currently on the fence of the property at the Cooper site would be integral to inside the building to recognize the history of the property. And that timeline really is sort of the cornerstone of the presentation here tonight. The Grand Trunk Master Plan states that the superstructure should be reused. We've talked about that. That's come to pass. 2023, all appeals and challenges related to expropriation are completed. The estate of Lawrence Ryan, and that's all settled, and all the appeals were done in 2023. And then shortly after that, months after that, the city began work on the ad hoc committee, of which I am a committee member of that ad hoc committee. And working groups and chairs were announced. 2024, the committee began to work to establish the guiding principles for the site. So there was a number of public meetings took place. The ad hoc committee listened to what the community had to say. They socialized some of the things that may happen. They talked about meetings like this. This presentation I'm here doing tonight, I think maybe I've done 20 of them, I think. I've done every service club. I did it at the Rotary Complex. We had a couple great events at the City Hall Auditorium. And, those, as I said, those were conversations. And through that, as well as the subject matter experts that were, on the ad hoc committee, and, Ron Dodson's here, and he's well connected to the arts community. Steve Cooper's an engineer. We had, people from education field. We had people legal field, environmentally, which is another area of Steve's interest. Throughout all those subject matter experts and through discussions with the community, there's guiding principles which were relayed to the city and embraced and passed without hardly any discussion late this fall. And they involve things like, at a high level, organic ideas about it should be a revenue positive place. The city doesn't have $1 billion to develop this. So as you proceed with this, you can't, the city has to do this wisely so that it's revenue positive. And the plan as it stands now is it would be. Even if there are some integral things that end up in the property that are community driven, the sale of the rest of the property, the development of places like we mentioned where the Dominion House used to be, or where St. John's Church used to be, or where the Mansion House used to be, or where the Avon Hotel used to be, as those places get developed and property around there gets developed, and as they sell off portions of the site to developers for housing, for condos, for retail, for the circus, for whatever. You know, they'll recover that money, and it can and should be revenue positive. A people place. It wants to be something that augments the city of Stratford, particularly its downtown. You know, and those were the guiding principles that we relayed to City Council and passed without any sort of angst or discussion. So that was very positive. Kelly? So there's the site today. So that's an aerial picture that was taken this summer. So what happens next? You know, what do we do next? If you look at this end, the end closest to me, that's where the fire was. That's also the area that is the most contaminated. So the question becomes, how contaminated is the site? It's contaminated, but it's no different. You know, Carol Mitchell was here last night, an environmental engineer. She's done a lot of work on the site over 20 years. I think it was, Steve, is it over 1,000 boreholes on the property? Yeah, over 1,000 boreholes. So there's been lots of data collected as to how contaminated the site is. That end, that's the end where there's coal tar. That's the end where there's real problems. But as you remediate a site, one of the things I learned is that you remediate it to what its end use is going to be. If it's going to be a parking lot or a parking garage, you don't need to really remediate it as much as you might other portions. So you can imagine here, this end, that's where the parking garage is going to be. So why is there a parking garage? Well, you're going to have to find a place to park, not only because Stratford has a parking issue, but if you look at that big parking lot, the theory is that that's all going to be developed, and that's going to get turned into revenue producing buildings. So you got to have parking. So the idea is that the parking garage is at this end. One of the early conceptual drawings, I want to repeat, conceptual idea drawings, was that the parking garage is at this end and it extends almost down to St. Patrick Street. And the entrance could be off St. Patrick Street as you go in there. Kelly? So the opportunity, we had a great meeting at the City Hall Auditorium. We had the Mayor of Kitchener was here, and the Cam Guthrie, the Mayor of Guelph, was here. And it was a real sort of, I think, epiphany moment for members of the committee, but also members of the community. And Cam Guthrie said, if you think about an 18-acre site on the cusp of Stratford's downtown that's under the municipality's control, there is not a city, town in this country that wouldn't like to be in that position. So the long-held 40-year-old idea that this is an eyesore and it's a problem and what are we going to do about it? He said the city and the community and city council and city staff and everybody around this needs to change their mindset about this. There's not a problem. This is an incredible opportunity. And what you do with it next is incredibly important because this is an opportunity like every municipality in this country would love to have, and in some ways, it's fallen in our lap. Mayor Kitchener, he said, if you think about, you know, the intelligent way to develop this, he said, when the Bauer Tannery factory closed in Kitchener, it was downtown. It was right on the Kitchener-Waterloo border. The tannery business is incredibly toxic, worse than steam locomotive repair. And right now you've got 4 or 5 condo buildings around there. You've got the Bauer Kitchen, you know, which is a fantastic restaurant that's right there. You've got Vincenzo's, that's a grocery store around there. You've got hardware stores. You've got clothing stores. You've got dry cleaners. You've got all these places you can walk. So the idea of the sort of historic American version of that urban ghetto where you've got 4 or 5 condo buildings and you have to go 5 miles to get a loaf of bread or 5 miles to get a sandwich, that sort of thing. So develop this wisely, and all of a sudden you've got an incredibly vibrant, you know, well-heeled neighborhood that in many ways somebody has a car and they might move their car once or twice a week because they don't have to go somewhere to get groceries. They don't have to get somewhere to get a prescription. And he said, done wisely, you can change the city for the next 50 years. And this is from 2 mayors. And he said, you know, just do this right. And he said, there's going to be some tough iron gut decisions when it comes to finances. Do you service the building? How much do you do before you give it to a developer? But at least control part of it and get what you want out of the property. He said it can be great. So here's part of what my job was and what the communications group was. And Herb Klassen and Karen Haslam did a lot of this summer. We did a lot of pop-ups. Went to the Loco, went to Pride Day, and there's a timeline that's on the side of the building there. And Kelly? So there's another picture there. That's, again, similar to the picture before, taken from inside. We talk about an industrial cathedral. Well, that's really what it's like. When you go to some of the, I was at a place in Pittsburgh not long ago that was a refurbished place. The HIP development in Cambridge is, very similar. The Toronto Hydro Power Plant, which it's the Toronto Hydro Power Plant, and it's in Niagara Falls. I know it seems odd, but it's just above Horseshoe Falls. It's a massive building, sort of similar to this, a million square feet. Also empty since the 1980s, ironically. The company my son works for, they've recently bought it. They're going to redevelop it into hotels, theater, casino, etc. So another great big, industrial cathedral like that. Kelly? So what do we know? Where are we at here? So the project, which will be revenue positive. So if you read on Facebook, which since November the 6th, I spend less time on social media, which has been healthy. But one of the things you read on a lot of Stratford websites, the city does not have $1 billion to develop this. That is correct. That is absolutely correct. Done right, nor do they need it. And the idea was this will be managed correctly. This will be a revenue positive project. Finally, knocking the building down is not going to be considered. We talked about that. The city's formed a number of committees. The key work is delivered to City Council in September for approval. Guiding principles are endorsed. Next thing, activation. Emily Robson, one of my great friends, she's one of the lead staff people from the City of Stratford on this project. Emily and I, do we talk every day? Most days. Yeah. So one of the things Emily's working on next is activation of the site. It's 2025. Ideally, there's a shovel in the ground in whole or in part in 2026. So what happens for the next year? Well, the idea of the ad hoc committee, which City Council also agreed with, is we should have some things happen inside that building. Stratford Summer Music, Lights on Stratford, the Stratford Perth Museum's Innkeeper's Dinner, the long table dinner for the chef school, things like that. A friend of mine who used to work at the Stratford Festival, worked with me in the parking lot at the Festival, Matt Nickel. He's head of North American operations for Cirque du Soleil. He says, geez, we'd love to do something in that building. He said, we'd love that. The high ceilings, the rafters, the steel. He said, let's think about that. So, like the whole thing, there's incredible possibilities here. How brave are people? How energetic are people? How willing are we to move forward? So I think one of the things you're going to start to see from that perspective is some activations on the property. Potential partners, what this may look like. It's early days. Don't hold me to this. There's a lot of things that have to happen here. The Y has been interested from the outset. The Y needs a much bigger Y. They've been, as we talked about at the start, from the very beginnings, the Y said we'd like to be part of this. Hopefully that can take place. One of the things is, for the Y to be involved, is the city prepared to put a roof on the building? Are they prepared to service the building? Put heat, water, and hydro in there so that the Y can build in there. That's a big decision. In the next month or so, that's going to go to City Council, and they've got to make some real critical decisions so we know which next tumblers fall. So the other one is, of course, the public library. That's been in the Beacon Herald. The public library's got great interest in, moving their operations there in whole or in part. And again, public libraries are municipal operations. That takes city investment. Are they prepared to do that? It's tough times. Taxes are high. It's going to be a very tough, steel stomach decision. The senior center, when the Tom Patterson Theatre was built, the senior center, the Kiwanis Center, was displaced. One of the conditions was that the city would replace the senior center down here. The question becomes now is, and Trudy Yonkman's here, and Trudy's on the committee, represents Stratford Seniors, do they want to be there? Does part of their programming want to be there? Does their programming want to be there? And maybe it's provided by the library. Maybe part of it's provided by the Y. We don't know yet. There's a few chess pieces to move around, but if we talk about your anchor tenants, there's a pretty good start, and add parking garage to that as well. Kelly? So 6218. There was 5 locomotives in the CNR fleet that could go from sea to shining sea. And this is one of them. And in the exhibit that we have here at the museum, there's a 75% scale picture of 6218. So this is maybe the most iconic photo of that train, hanging from the rafters, hanging from the crane at the shops. So as people look at the shops and they, go through Dean Robinson's book or look at the exhibit here, this is often one of the first pictures that pops up. So I was here, I was still working at the museum, and I was on this committee, and I thought, geez, I wonder where that train is. Like, I wonder whatever happened to that. A lot of them got cut apart, sold for scrap, etc. So I start doing a bit of research, and I find the train. And the train is at the Railway Museum in Fort Erie, Ontario. So, bit of a quiet day here at the museum, and I phoned down there. I phoned the person at the Fort Erie Museum, and I said, "So you've got 6218, eh?" And then she said, "We have a train." I said, "Yeah, it's 6218, a big steam locomotive." Yeah. So it's at the Fort Erie Museum. I said, "Yeah, and it's outside." She says, "Yeah, it's outside." And I talked about how it got there, and she said that after the CNR got out of the steam business, it left Stratford. It went to Fort Erie because Fort Erie continued to disassemble trains long after Stratford closed. They sold them for scrap, and they did some what they called parade runs, which is where they had steam locomotives that would go on a run for publicity or run from this small town to that small town, and 6218 was part of that. It was designated to get scrapped. The Retirees Association at the Fort Erie shops, much smaller than here, said, "We'd like to refurbish it." Asked CN for permission. They refurbished it. That's why it ended up in Fort Erie. Part of the conversation with my counterpart at the museum there, person said, "Do you want it or something?" I said, "I don't know." I said, is it available? Well, we have 9 museums in Fort Erie. We've mothballed 3 of them. And would the train, if it went to Stratford, would it go inside? I said, "Yes, it would." Well, it's outside now, and museums, their real priority is the health and the environment and the conditions for the artifacts, in this case, a train. Her and I both felt it would be better off inside. So she said, "Let's have a conversation about this at a later date." I've had a conversation about this at the ad hoc committee. I've had a conversation with this at the museum. The museum's got a letter ready to send off to that museum asking that it get deaccessioned there and its ownership get transferred here. I don't think anybody here is willing to go down and pick it up and bring it back here. So transfer of it here is a bit of an issue. But, it's a small world. As Kelly said, I do a bit of work with Hockey Canada, sit on a number of committees. The chair of Hockey Canada is a guy named Jonathan Goldblum from Montreal. He used to be on the board of the Stratford Festival, knows Stratford very well. He's previously the chair of Via Rail. I talked to him about this. Jonathan puts me in touch with a person, puts me in touch with another person. And about 2 months ago, have a conversation with a guy, and he says, "Okay," so he said, "You're interested in this train to Fort Erie about getting it to Stratford?" I said, "I am." And we talked to a trucking company, Grant Transport, not out of New Hamburg, but out of Milton, that does huge mining equipment. They move mining equipment around. They move, they work on the 401, big equipment. He said, they put me in touch with a company that said, we can move it, but it's about a year. We have engineers go along the path. They have to examine every bridge, width of the highway, raise telephone wires, how low bridges are, what the density of bridges are, the robustness of bridges it has to go over. And by the way, you can't use 400 series highways. So I don't know how you get from Fort Erie to Stratford without doing that anyways. And it's $1 million. He said, we're probably north of $1 million. And Via Rail said about 2 months ago, they said, tell you what, we'll meet you down there in January, February, and if it'll roll, we'll bring it to Stratford. I said, so what are we talking? He said, nothing. If it'll roll, we'll bring it to Stratford. Now the question is, will it roll? So they're going to go down there and take a good long look at it. If it won't roll, it's not the end of the world. They said we can put it on these little chassis. If it'll lift, set it on chassis, and then the chassis roll. It said the weight's not as scary as you might think. So anyways, one of the exciting things that's come out of this is the potential to get 6218 back here. A lot of things have to happen. The Niagara Region Museums have to agree to give it up. Via Rail has to move it here. We got to get project ready here, and all those sorts of things. Interestingly enough, I mentioned this to Dean Robinson, and he'd gone so far as to have drawings done for how it would be in situ, as they say in the museum industry, how it would be in situ in the shops. So if you imagine, if you're at the bus terminal on Downey Street and you look at that end of the building, the idea was to build a pedestal up for that, right up the rafters where the train's that high, and it's sitting on a platform at the height of the ceiling at the east end of the building looking towards Downey Street, and then to have that end of the building glass and have light behind the train, so as people drive up and down Downey Street, you see this train sitting, look like it's hanging from the ceiling. We talk about being brave. We talk about great ideas. Do we have the stomach for this? Do we want to do something like that? Not many guys 67 years old quote Eminem, but you got one chance, you got one opportunity, and I think this is really, really where we're at.
You're here.
Yeah. Kelly? So there's the train as it sits today. I was at a hockey tournament in Niagara Falls. I thought, geez, I'm pretty close. I'll head down there. So I head down there and that's a picture that I took. That would have been in November of this year. And Kelly, you want to try the next slide here? All right, hopefully this works. It worked last night. This is my attempt at Steven Spielberg and Craig Thompson and all those sorts of people. So I'm only 5'4". I'm not as tall as Kelly, but I'm only 5'4", but those wheels are a little bit taller than I am. Well, I stood in it to give you some idea of the scale of that building. The wheels are bigger than I am. Yeah. So 400,000 pounds is what it weighs empty. And it is, to put it in perspective, size of it, home to first base on a Major League Baseball diamond. That's 90 feet. This is 104 feet. That's how big it is. So there it is there. And didn't look in bad shape. I said, I'm pretty sure some WD-40 can get that thing rolling, but we'll see. So, all right, Kelly. So, engage Stratford. More information there. What's happening, what's updates, city council minutes, agendas, things about what's happening next. And there you go. That's the presentation. Thanks very much.